Joining me this Wednesday morning is Brandeis politics professor Zachary Albert, who holds expertise in political campaigns and public policy making, specifically through the lens of increased partisan polarization. Professor, thank you for taking the time to join the program.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, William.
Before we talk about the midterm 2022 election results, I was wondering if you could share with our listeners how your approach to teaching your two fall courses, one called Elections in America, the other named The Politics of Policymaking, changed this semester and within the last 2 weeks.
Hmm, that's a great question. And, I always purposely teach my elections class in the fall semester because I think it's so interesting to teach it as we're tracking these races unfolding. And so, I always try to tie it to current events and what's going on. And one thing we've really been, tossing around and playing with this semester is the topic of, what do we expect out of a midterm election like this? And what are some of the reasons that those expectations might be wrong? And I think that that's kind of the perfect framework for when we actually get into the results from last night, and results that are still coming in, kind of try to make sense of what does history tell us, and what's weird and unique about this particular moment. And so that's one thing that I've been doing is talking a lot about sort of the fundamental factors like the economy, and incumbent approval, and then some of the more quirky things like the Dobbs decision and Republican sort of candidate selection problems and these types of topics I'm sure we'll talk more about. And then the policy class that I'm also teaching is, I obviously view it as kind of downstream from elections. Elections are the way that we get the policymakers that we get. And so we talk quite a bit about some of these same dynamics, how are elections unfolding, what are the types of candidates we're getting, and what do they do once they get into office. So hopefully we can also talk a bit about, what this means for governance. Again, with the results that we know at the moment, we can make some educated guesses about, what the House and the Senate and governance overall is going to look like.
Absolutely. Before then, I just also wanted to ask, as a voter, educator, and American, how have you seen the role of the media change in the last 20 years for election coverage?
Hmm. Another great question. So, obviously there's a few ways you could approach this question. One has to do with, how does traditional media, thinking about newspapers, cable television, how are they covering politics, and how has that changed over time? And then the other big topic we could talk a bit about is social media and how that's been quite the game changer. On the topic of traditional media sources, I think we have seen a growing tendency for people to first off select into media environments that match their partisan preferences and their overall sort of values and attitudes. As there's been more choice over time, that gives people the option to either opt out of listening to or watching political news. So people who are not interested are simply not really following this stuff as closely. And for those who are interested, Republicans are going to select into Fox News and One America and Wall Street Journal and National Review and these types of, more right-leaning outlets. And the same is true for Democrats. And so we've seen, to some degree, sort of a sorting of people into news environments where they're hearing oftentimes different information, which is worrisome. We're going to talk a bit about, what this election tells us about divisions in the American public. And I think that, the divides in terms of where people get their media and their information is part and parcel with that. And so they're hearing different information, and they're also hearing information that largely confirms what they already believe. If you're listening to Fox News, you probably believe Republicans are good and Democrats are bad, and you're hearing a lot of messaging to reinforce that. So obviously media plays a role in polarization as well. And everything I just said can probably be, doubly true for social media. And social media introduces a few other worrisome trends, which have to do with things like misinformation, disinformation, either intentional or unintentional efforts to mislead people, which kind of exacerbates that problem of having different information that folks are working from. Given the information that people are exposed to, it's very hard for a Democrat and a Republican who buy into the party messaging and the information they're hearing to have a reasonable conversation. It's almost like there's no middle ground for that conversation to be had, which again I think traces back to traditional media, but especially social media.
We'll start right off with polarization. What surprised you with regards to control of House and Senate seats last night?
Yeah. So, overall, my biggest surprise was that things were much more competitive than I thought they would be. Democrats kind of overperformed both the polls and history. So leading into last night, there are a lot of reasons to think that Democrats would not do very well. Republicans would perform very well, pick up a lot of seats in the House, probably take the Senate. And so the reasons for that are, as I mentioned, sort of these fundamental factors leading into a midterm election like this. And so, right after the 2020 election, if you had asked me to make an educated guess about who would control the chambers after 2022, I would have said Republicans, just because the president's party always seems to perform poorly in midterm elections. So that would be the Democrats this year. We would expect them to not do very well. People are dissatisfied with the president and the things that he has or hasn't been able to get done. The opposition party's base is more mobilized to turn out to vote. And so typically we see these midterm effects where incumbent parties lose quite a few seats. Add to that the fact that, the fundamentals like the economy, inflation is quite high. People are quite worried about that. And you tend to blame the party in power for these types of things. The incumbent president approval, Biden's approval rating was about 42%, which was actually higher than it had been in recent months. And so, a pretty unpopular president. And so add all these things together and you'd really expect Democrats to perform poorly, Republicans to perform very well and take definitely the House, but probably the Senate as well. And what we're seeing so far, and again, the big caveat, we're talking at about 10:30, the day after Election Day. So the big caveat is that we still don't know a lot, but we have some inklings of how things are going to turn out. And it seems like it's going to be, one of the weakest performance for an out party in decades. So Republicans sort of really not living up to expectations, which is a big surprise.
Is there a particular individual or collection of efforts at fault for Republicans, given that there was no quote unquote red wave as what everybody expected?
So you can't pin it on any one person or one thing, but I think there's a few likely factors at play here. The big one is, one of the big ones is abortion. So, all those fundamental factors that we talked about, they ran headfirst into the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court, which sort of made an issue that, disadvantages Republicans. They're sort of out of line with public opinion on this issue. It became much more salient. So that was, voters are thinking about that a bit more. I think Democrats were quite worried that abortion had kind of peaked too soon and people weren't thinking about it anymore. But it does seem that, it probably did mobilize and energize a core of voters over the summer who decided they were going to vote Democratic and actually followed through on that. And so turnout as a result of the Dobbs decision, was probably a factor here. And actually, if you look at some of the ballot initiatives in places like Kentucky and Montana, fairly red states, they actually voted against anti-abortion ballot initiatives. So it really shows that Republicans are out of touch on this issue. And as it became more salient, it served as a counterpoint to their messaging on the economy and crime, where they are closer to what the voters believe. So that's that sort of issue of abortion is one factor. I think the poor candidate quality on the Republican side is also a factor. Republicans in their primaries, when they're selecting their nominees, they have a bigger problem than Democrats when it comes to weeding out bad candidates, basically gatekeeping and determining who's going to be the standard bearer for our party in the general election. And what we saw this year is that there were quite a few inexperienced candidates that were somewhat extreme, somewhat out of step with their district, a lot of election deniers. So I'm thinking about folks like, Don Bolduc in New Hampshire, Doug Mastriano running for governor in Pennsylvania. So these candidates, and Mitch McConnell actually was quoted as saying, we have a candidate quality problem. And so, Republicans to some degree, it appears, shot themselves in the foot. They took a race where they were advantaged and they nominated some low quality candidates in these competitive districts or states. And it's not panning out for them in some instances. The two examples I gave both lost. I think we could also talk a little bit about, like the role of Trump. So he's still very in the news. So to some degree, I think Trump was on the ballot, and we can compare that with Biden's more low profile. He realizes he's unpopular, and he really hasn't been, out there stumping for a lot of competitive candidates. I think his last appearance was in Maryland, a pretty solidly blue state. So he wasn't out there trying to push the needle, which might have backfired. So yeah, I think these are some of the things that folks will be looking at when we do our postmortems to understand what happened.
whether it was a governor race or House or Senate, was there a particular race in general that just you did not see that one coming?
I mean, everybody was kind of interested in watching the Pennsylvania race, Fetterman versus Oz. There were some, interesting headline grabbing dynamics there. And it is, interesting and important that it seems like Pennsylvania is going to be a Democratic pickup with John Fetterman winning. So that's one that, everyone was keeping their eye on, rightly so. Beyond that, I think, obviously there's four more races that we're going to have to keep an eye on: Arizona, Wisconsin, Nevada, and then Georgia. And so these are all Senate races. And if we take things where they stand now, it seems like basically it's going to once again come down to a runoff in Georgia in December to decide the control of the Senate, much like 2020. It's some deja vu going on here. And so, for your listeners, a runoff just means that in, the general election, neither candidate, Warnock or Walker in the Georgia Senate race, neither candidate got a majority, 50+%. And so Georgia has this rule where you have to go to a runoff then between just the two top vote getters, and it'll force one of them to have a majority. And so we probably, if it comes down to Georgia, we probably won't know who controls the Senate until December. And so, like I said, this is exactly what happened in 2020, and it's something that people are going to really be keeping their eye on. You're going to see a lot of election activity after the election day, because there's still going to be this all important race that might decide control of the Senate. So that's one I'll definitely continue to keep my eye on as well.
I wanted to shift over and talk about regrets, both from Republicans and Democrats. And what do you think they learned from yesterday and will begin focusing on now in preparation for the 2024 presidential election?
Yeah. So, if I was a Republican strategist, one lesson I would probably take from this is that Trump had a pretty bad night. I'm not sure that he will take that lesson from this, but it does seem that, a lot of his candidates in competitive races underperformed. A lot of these, more MAGA election denying types, they had a worse night than they probably could have and probably should have. They still won a lot of their races, right? So there's going to be a lot of election deniers in office, just because they were running in really safe seats. But overall, it seems at present that, Trump kind of underperformed. And we can contrast that with Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, newly reelected governor. And he really outperformed both his last election and Republicans nationwide. So, as Republicans are really underperforming across the board, Ron DeSantis overperformed. And so that's interesting because it means that this potential opponent for Trump in 2024, Ron DeSantis, who's really very clearly gearing up for a presidential run, he did very well at a time that Trump didn't. So it might say something interesting about, where the party is going on the Republican side.
Can you share with our listeners what Ron DeSantis was able to do with regards to creating four election districts, four congressional districts? I don't know if you were aware of that.
I'm not super familiar.
Okay, well, what I've read is I believe that he was able to push through legislation that created effectively four districts in Florida. And a lot of Republican strategists were saying, no, this is going to go to the courts. And instead, DeSantis pushed it all the way through.
Right. So it speaks to the fact that this election was coming after, redistricting and gerrymandering. And that's not the only state where there were court challenges ongoing leading into election day when it comes to districting. I'm not super sure about the exact dynamics at play in Florida, though, but probably worth looking into.
And then switching over to Democrats, leading up to the midterms, it seemed that President Biden and Vice President Harris did not travel often to battleground states, and instead they went to cities and states, whether it was California, Boston, New York. Do you think that there is some regret with that? If, as we see now, that Democrats likely will lose control of the House and that the Senate race is again very still tight, but that they were unable to, I guess the state that comes to mind right now, 10:45 on this Wednesday morning is Nevada, where it looks like that it will go back to being held by a Republican. Any regret by Democrats there?
I would think not. Like I said, the sort of the benchmark here is that we would really expect Democrats to get trounced based on historical factors and
So they were
fundamental.
just praying for the best, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see the added value that could have come from them being more involved in competitive races. In fact, I think it would be more likely to backfire. And so, keeping a low profile was probably the best strategy for them. And looking to 2024, I can't really see how you could paint these results tonight or today as being bad for Biden in 2024. You know, first off, if Republicans do take control of the House, then he's going to be able to totally deflect blame for any stalled agenda items that he has to the Republican Party. Right now, you know, his failure to do certain things is all on Democratic, you know, infighting and you know, not having a filibuster proof majority and sort of the nature of the Senate and things like that. But it falls kind of on the Democrats' shoulders. If Republicans are the ones that are perceived as holding up his agenda, I think that accrues to his benefit. And like I said, you know, the Democrats doing better than everyone thought means that he's not really being perceived as sort of an anchor on his party, despite his low approval rating. He's not so much of a net negative that Democrats are underperforming because of him, which again I think accrues to his benefit and makes a stronger case for him to run again in 2024.
Well, how do you think that the White House's approach and strategies to sending legislation to Congress will change again if Democrats hold the Senate and Republicans regain control of the House? Do you think that Leader McCarthy will enable the same tactics that Pelosi used when Trump was in office?
Yeah, so I think starting with that last question about Leader McCarthy in the House, I think he's going to have a hell of a job to
He's
do.
been waiting for this field day. He's very eager.
Yes, but I think he might have a little bit of buyer's remorse with what he gets. So it's looking like he's going to have a narrow majority. So maybe, you know, a 10-seat majority in the House. And that might prove to be unmanageable for him. Because there is a growing sort of faction of what I would call like burn it all down to the ground type members in the Republican Party. These are, you know, folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene and MAGA candidates in the Freedom Caucus who would rather just grind everything to a halt to prevent things they don't like than to sort of proactively try to pass legislation. And so, you know, with a narrow majority, every vote in the Republican Party really matters. You need every vote in order to get to that majority. You can't really lose these types. And so as the clout of these, you know, burn it all down types grows, McCarthy's going to have to pay more and more attention to them. And so I imagine even his vote to become the speaker is going to be chaotic. But beyond that, I mean, when it comes to things like raising the debt limit and like required bills, like, you know, appropriations bills, I mean, these are things where the party is internally divided. It's going to be hard to get those, extremists to come along. And beyond that, it's kind of hard to picture like what their policy agenda would even look like. Some of them want to cut aid to Ukraine and funding for the Ukrainian war, and others don't, and they support that. A lot of them want to investigate the Biden administration, so we'll probably see some of that. But I'm not sure if there's even unity on that issue. And so, you know, I'm not sure what will get done in the House other than kind of blocking Biden's agenda. And so one thing that will be really big is if the Democrats are able to keep the Senate, because, you know, the Senate confirms Biden's nominees. And so if he's able to, you know, keep a narrow majority there, he'll be able to keep appointing judges and keep appointing people to nominated positions. There's been talk about Republicans in the House writing up articles of impeachment for Biden. Now, they wouldn't ever get passed in the Senate, but a Senate majority for Republicans would give it a little bit more traction. And so, you know, if the Democrats can keep the Senate, that would neutralize that threat to some degree. And so, you know, it's probably not going to be, you know, functional governance, but it's probably not also going to be the type of runaway Republican agenda that we would have seen if they had taken control of the Senate and the House, which is still, of course, possible. But these narrow majorities are going to be really tough. And Republicans especially seem like they're not as well adept at dealing with them compared with Democrats who've had some success this last year dealing with narrow majorities.
Well, I did want to talk about functional governance. In various states, the senators and governor are not of the same party. And a perfect example of this is in Arizona, where both senators are Democrats, while the governor's mansion is held by a Republican. What does that indicate about voters and their satisfaction with both parties?
Yeah. So, having divided government like that is not as common as it once was. So partisanship is a more important motivator, more straight ticket voting. There's some evidence that maybe this year there's actually less straight ticket voting. And so, you know, whether it's Alaska or whether it is, at the national level, some of this has to do with how maps are drawn, how districts are drawn, quirks of sort of our system. But some of it also may have to do with the fact that, voters are a little bit more attuned to what's going on and nuanced in their response to candidates in different electoral dynamics than we sometimes give them credit for. So we can maybe see, 2022 as sort of a light rebuke of Biden, but voters being unwilling to, hand the reins over to Republicans, and so or hand full control over to Republicans. So, to some degree, it seems like there's a lot of negativity driving folks' votes, and I think that's probably a manifestation of that, right? You're not fully satisfied with Biden. You're kind of a little bit disappointed, and so you're voting kind of against him to some degree, but you're also maybe not in love with the Republican Party. You don't really like them, some of the dynamics you're seeing over there, and so there's a trope that a lot of times you're selecting the least worst option. That may be what's going on here. You look at the candidates that are out there, and you pick the ones that you can kind of tolerate the most, and sometimes that's a Democrat and sometimes that's a Republican.
Do you think this is going to be applied to the state of Kentucky, where there is a Democrat governor, and also in the state of Kansas, where they just reelected a Democrat governor?
Yeah, I mean, at the state level, you have some idiosyncrasies. Like, Massachusetts recently had a Republican governor in Charlie Baker, and now we're going to replace him with Maura Healey, who won handily against Jeff Deal. And so a lot of this comes down to sort of the nature of the state politics. And so I'll go with the Massachusetts example because that's what I'm most familiar with, although maybe not the most interesting one. But Charlie Baker, a very moderate Republican. He was able to win. Again, I think voters do like to put some check on like one party governance, as you were alluding to. And so they don't mind electing a moderate Republican to serve as sort of a break on some of the impulses of Massachusetts Democrats. And so that moderate sort of Republican dynamic works. It's worked in Connecticut in the past. It works in Massachusetts. It works in a lot of these other states where even though they're blue, you can nominate a moderate Republican and they can win. And then moving into 2022, there was a primary between two Republicans, Jeff Deal, and I forget the name of the other. Oh, Chris Doty was the other Republican, and Chris Doty was more moderate. Jeff Deal, much more conservative, much more out of touch with Massachusetts, and he got his butt kicked by Maura Healey. Roughly 2/3 of the vote she earned, and so it goes to show that voters do like to mix things up a little bit, I think, and do like to have some divided government and check the impulses of one party government, but there are certainly limits to that. They're not going to select an extreme candidate who's really out of touch with the district.
Shifting gears, I wanted to get your interpretation and perspective on this. Analysis frequently cite Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio as swing states, yet seemingly some of these states over the years have remained blue or red for particular races. Do you, again, this is now 2022, right after midterm election season, do you have a reformed list of swing states?
I mean, clearly we're going to need to be keeping an eye on Georgia, Pennsylvania, sort of perennially, at least for right now. It does seem to some degree like Florida is maybe moving out of that column a little bit more solidly Republican. DeSantis has done some work there to, I think, shift the needle a little bit. It'll be interesting to see presidential level in 2024 what things look like, but Florida does seem to be moving a bit away from the swing state status that it once had. And so again, you're going to want to be looking at places like Pennsylvania and Georgia. Ohio, I would still probably include on that list. Wisconsin to some degree, although at the state government level, Wisconsin Republicans are really locking things down, so that might change as well moving forward.
Okay. As Americans continue to monitor results closely in the next few days, what does all this say about 2024? Specifically, what candidates and campaigns could we expect?
Yeah, so it seems pretty likely that Trump is going to announce, although I think his case is much weaker than it was 2 days ago. And so it'll be interesting to see if he delays that, but I imagine Trump is going to run again, and he's going to run very much on the same issues that he's been talking about: election denialism, running not only against Democrats but against Republicans who are perceived as sort of being against him, running on sort of this MAGA agenda. I wouldn't be surprised if even issues like immigration and some of these things that he talked about quite a bit on the 2016 campaign trail are less important than they were before, right? He has sort of a devoted following that is not so much issue based. And so that's one dynamic I would keep an eye on is when and how Trump announces and what story he's selling voters for why he should be returned to the presidency. I do think that he's not going to coast to the nomination. I have to imagine that someone like DeSantis smells a little bit of blood in the water and thinks that this is a prime moment to try to get the nomination and take Trump on. Although, maybe he decides not to run if Trump announces soon. And I think that's the reason that Trump is planning on announcing soon, is to try to ward off some of the potential challengers that might emerge. So the level of competition on the Republican side will be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. Another big question mark is, does Biden run for re-election? It seems like he's going to. He's quite old. Trump is quite old, right? So, there's a possibility that neither of them run, although, again, it seems like both are leaning towards running. And then what does that look like? Does anybody step up to challenge him? It's unlikely that they would, but it's possible. So another thing I would keep an eye on is signaling from Democrats.
And I'm pulling this one right out of left field here, but what do you think the role of, and this is specific here, Montana Senator, Democratic Senator John Tester, what role do you think he has within the Democratic Party or within the Biden administration in the next couple of years?
Why do you ask about that in particular? I'm curious.
The reason why is just you think of a Democrat from rural Montana who is able to maintain moderate views, who agrees with Republicans on a variety of issues, but also Democrats. And I'm just curious if the if the Biden administration will use that to their advantage, or even just the Democratic caucus.
Yeah, I mean it's possible, and it does seem that Democrats are more attuned to specific dynamics at the state and local level, where they are a little bit better at matching candidates to the district that they're running in, and not sort of punishing in primaries candidates who are perceived as being too moderate for the Democratic Party nationally, because punishing those types of candidates can mean that you lose a race that you could win, like in New Hampshire, right? You nominate someone like Don Bolduc, who is much more conservative, and you end up taking a race that could have been competitive and making it less competitive. We can talk about a number of examples that fit that category. I think Democrats are a little bit better at not doing that, at allowing candidates who aren't checking every box that every Democratic activist would like them to check, but that are a good match for the seat that they're running for. And so I don't know that there's going to be some surge of power for folks like Tester and moderates, where they really become sort of the guiding light and the most prominent voice in the party. But I do think that they'll continue to get the leeway that they've been afforded moving forward because it's worked for them. So,
Professor Albert, thank you again for joining the program today and providing critical analysis.
absolutely, it's been really great talking about this. Take care, William.
Take care.